This is the Tapped In Podcast, the podcast for beverage distributors that want to empower their sales team to drive business results. Listen up and welcome back to another episode of the Tapped In Sales, the podcast for beer distributors by beer distributors. But we're here with a wine guy today, Mikey, Chris Ireland from Ireland Family Wine and Spirits. I don't know if we are excited about having a wine guy in here or something else, but I am today because Chris shared something with me called Supplier Math 101. And we're going to kind of unpack that concept. And I think that was incredible. So
you must be pretty excited. You nailed that intro.
I did. Yes. I'm so excited. And at the end of it, like when everybody listens to this, it'll be perfect because I'm going to edit all that out together.
Oh, man, you should leave it just the way that it was. It's perfect.
No, I can't leave it. Not for our man, Chris. Are you kidding me? So, Chris, thanks for joining us today. Tell the crew a little bit about you and Ireland Family Wine and Spirits and what you do every day professionally and how you came to be in where you're at right now.
Great. Well, first of all, Bud and Mike, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on because what this did for me is give me an opportunity to think and look into a part of the industry that I've not been familiar with during my career, which is beer. Understanding that that's the primary audience for the podcast. And so I found it kind of interesting to kind of think through, my experience with a new lens. So a little bit about myself. I was in the beverage alcohol industry for about 25 years. I started as a bartender as a way to pay my way through college. And that, it's interesting to look back on it now and how that path took different twists and turns along the way to arrive at where I am today. But, I worked for a couple of importers. I was, prior to that, I was a restaurant manager and buyer for developing a Wine Spectator award-winning wine list, which is what jumped me into wine. A couple of importers. I worked for the importer for Catena, which was back when a time when people didn't know what Malbec was. But really, it was 12 years at the Hess Collection out of Napa that I gained a lot of experience and knowledge about the industry. But along the way, I had a goal and a vision to have my own company. And I took that step by resigning February 10th, 2020, which was ironic timing.
Perfect timing.
Yeah. And so, from there, I just held on tight for the first year or so. And of course, it takes a little while to get wine to market once you make that decision, especially if you're buying grapes. And so for the first couple of years, it was pretty touch and go, but we started shipping wine in early 22. And, here we are today, with plenty of struggles along with the industry, but still moving forward. So that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome. What's your portfolio look like? Is it more all high-end stuff, mid-grade stuff, day-to-day table wine, or a little bit everything?
So the vision is really to focus on independence, which I've shifted this year. And so I am revamping the portfolio or refocusing my attention on developing the portfolio. So the next step for the company is really about, which I'll get into based on your questions, fleshing out, a broader portfolio of independent producers, really who at this point in time in the industry, I know are struggling, especially if they're operating by themselves. The importance of, amplifying your voice within a broader portfolio with distributors who are so busy that, for beer or wine, it's really hard to give attention to somebody who represents less than 1% of your revenue.
That is where we kind of want to make a jumping off point. You and I met at an Ohio beer distributor meeting. Well, it's Ohio beer and wine distributor meeting. And you shared a presentation with the group, which at the kind of the meat of the bones at the end of it was Supplier Math 101. And to me, what I found fascinating was it was the first time when we talked earlier in this year about planning to do the podcast together. It was the first time I've seen a supplier say, hey, here's the math between how many times I present a product, how many times a product gets placed. This is the difference of what sales reps rate of close is versus a regional person at a winemaker versus the owner or the winemaker themselves as well, and how you actually kind of mathematically piece together that supplier side. So I found that fascinating. But the part I want to kind of jump off with is like, where did you come to that conclusion? Like, how did this infrastructure of Supplier Math 101 start with you?
Yeah, so I think the background would be many years of failure, honestly, and sitting in front of distributors trying to have a conversation that was oftentimes unproductive. And part of it had to do with my understanding, and part of it had to do with the distributor's mindset. And so for me, there was just a disconnect, and I was fortunate enough to work for the Hess Collection, and then the family transitioned the generations, and the new generation brought in a couple of executives from Treasury, ex-Treasury executives. And so when you look at the people that really move the market in the wine industry and the beer industry, there's about 5 companies that really drive, the business, and they're highly professional, and their systems are proven. They do an excellent job of the nuts and bolts, I'll call it. And so learning that system from them over time was one of the most important aspects of my career. And then I started to think about it from my background and add my own content to it. And I think one of the things that I have that a lot of people don't in the beverage industry in general is, one, I have an economics degree. That's probably not unheard of, but I'm just statistically minded. And initially in my career, when I graduated college, I wanted to be a stockbroker. I interviewed at Merrill Lynch at the time, and the guy told me, "Look, you don't have any experience. Go sell copiers for a while," and which is a very difficult job. And learn about rejection and sales. And I did that, and then I went to go work for Pitney Bowes. And the way that they train their sales force has direct implications on really CPG industries across the board. There are metrics that they follow that you can look to and learn from and apply in this industry. And so when I put 2 and 2 together, I started coming up with some of the critical metrics that go into the fundamentals that result in execution. And so I started to just do my own equations and come up with a system that really I felt was more applicable to what I was doing at the time. And I think overall, what I would say is it dramatically improved the communication between myself and distributors as I went into senior leadership and developed a team and then taught them those things. And so we just were a much more highly functioning team together, distributor and supplier alike.
Nice. What can you expand a little bit on some of those like matrix that you were looking at? When you said you changed your whole thought process there,
Yeah.
expand a little bit on that. What were you doing?
Yeah. So one of the things is, the typical, and I don't know about the beer industry, but I imagine it's roughly the same, because I had a few people come up to me after, my speech at the
Very
Ohio
similar.
wholesalers.
We'd like to think that it's different, but it's very similar. At the end of the day, you're trying to put great fluid on the shelf. People pick it up. The vessels it's in is slightly different. The pricing per ounce might be slightly different.
Yep.
Some of the promotional features might, but we're not that special of a snowflake.
Yeah, the funny thing is I remember at a time I was in an executive meeting in Napa, and I remember somebody saying it's not rocket science. And oftentimes these things, kind of like Supplier Math 101, they come to me kind of tongue in cheek. And so, Supplier Math 101 happened because I was sitting at a distributor annual review, and I started asking questions. And Mike, to answer your question, I started asking questions like, how many licensees are in the state? And so, the answer, I don't remember the answer, but let's just say 30,000. Florida's a huge market. And so then, you ask, well, what's the viable universe for our brand? And then you define the metrics behind that. You sell for $15 and up retail. You take out any import only sets or wine lists. And then you start to filter down, and then you come up with the viable universe. And then from there, you ask a simple question, what's realistic in 5 years, right? So you start to gain alignment, and it's how you talk to and partner with your distributor and have common communication and speak in their terms. And so as I was asking this question, the business manager said, well, that's supplier math, as a way to just dismiss, because distributors are busy. And they, one of the things I was told by an executive at a distributor years ago is their job is to get you out of the room as fast as possible, feeling good about yourself. So, I thought,
No, we would never do that.
Never.
well, I mean,
Never. Want to go to lunch?
there's
You ready
something
for lunch?
to that. But if as a supplier, you need to recognize is that's going to happen if you don't show up with a value oriented mindset. If you show up and all you're talking about is your production goals and all you're talking about is what you need to accomplish and you're not putting it in mutual terms, they're going to stop listening or they're going to tell you what you want to hear and you're going to leave the room. The issue from the distributor's perspective, I'm probably getting a little broad on the topic, and Mike, I'll come back to answer your question specifically. The challenge for distributors is how do you lead your suppliers to having productive conversations with you based on what's good for you and for them. And so if they're showing up for production goals, that's bottoms up planning. And if you're not having a conversation about top down, you're going to miss what is truly magical about that conversation, which is what is the potential of that brand for both parties and how do we achieve that and where do we start? And so to me, then you start looking at execution. And Mike, coming back around to your question, what does execution need to look like? How many sales reps are there? What other goals and priorities do you have? And where does each supplier fit in? And how many presentations or how much time can that sales force spend on your portfolio? And so then you're like, all right, well, if there's 30,000, the viable universe for us is 10. And so in 5 years, what is a realistic, and you can use benchmarks from other brands to establish this, what is a realistic footprint? What is our potential, right? Say it's 5,000 just for the sake of argument. And then you start asking questions. Okay, so what's reasonable in year one? How many times can we have your sales force be on a gold model with this brand? And then start breaking it down with, things like the number of presentations and what's the conversion rate on those presentations. Or when I was in copier sales, it was close rate. If that is 10%, then you're probably going to get 500 presentations and you're only going to get 50 of those in the first go. So how often can you be on the programming model and for those numbers to actually be meaningful? And then what does a pod represent? Is it a case? Is it 5 cases if it's a cheaper beer? And so then you start to get an idea of where the volume is coming from for pods, and depletions is pods plus velocity over time. So, the idea behind that is when you start piecing those metrics together, you're having a common conversation and your distributor is gaining alignment because they're contributing to the conversation. If you don't gain alignment, you're not going to execute.
Yep. And I popped open a shared screen. I think you can see this now,
Yep.
Right, Chris? And
I can see it.
And are we cool to share this?
Yeah, of course.
All right, awesome. So this was in your presentation, just for anybody watching on YouTube. Chris put this together in his presentation, trying to zoom in so we can see it a little bit better. But
yeah, that's good because nobody could have seen it from the audience that day because it was just too much words on a page. But
I saw it. I saw it from the back, and I was sitting in the back left corner where I usually do in these meetings as well.
Okay.
So
that's good to hear. I got a sense looking at it from the stage that it was hard to see.
You're good. It worked for me. So here you just walked through some of that in 10,000 licensees, 5,000. This is 5,000 could buy $20 or more for a sales to consumer.
Yeah.
Or price to consumer.
So 5,000. So you use comps. So let's say that, for instance, I'm a domestic brewery and, a large-ish microbrewery and trying to figure out, per case where my brand fits. And so you look at the, let's just put it in beer terms, $20 and up SRP. You can convert that to distributors' wholesale cost per case and then just look at the data. The data will tell you, here's the number of accounts that you sell, $20 a case beer to, and then you start to filter out and kind of get into a little bit more of a target list. And then, you have a conversation of, like I said, what does year one look like? How do
Yeah.
we break this down, by salesperson?
And that's what I loved about this. The other thing that was fascinating to me is you thinking through a 10%, let's do this highlight, let's see if this will work. The 10% conversion rate, like you're thinking through conversion rate on your presentations in wine. And for beer, it's so much of like, well, here's the target distribution list. Just like basically brush off, hey, I'm going to send this in and give this a try. And that's the presentation. It's like a brush off sales pitch in beer because the
Yeah.
velocities. And I don't know if it shouldn't be like that or if it should be like that. I think it is like that because the velocity is higher. It's like to sell a 4 6 pack case is probably gonna, if it's really bad, it's probably going to take a month. But if you drop off a case of wine, like that could take quite a bit of time in certain stores. Do you think it's because the retailers are more picky, or do you think it's because of that velocity thing of beer versus wine, or do you think it's something different?
Well, so there's, I think, distinct differences between the two categories from a consumer behavior standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I would say that the same philosophy applies, though. It's exactly the same, because what you're talking about is the same thing I'm talking about. Is someone has to ask the buyer or the account to, and so that's a close, right? When you say, hey, did you like this? Are you interested? Can I send you a case next week?
Yeah.
That's just a close. And so to me, the philosophy is exactly the same. Regardless of what's on the shelf or in the restaurant. It could be toilet paper for that matter. It's exactly the same concept. But I'm sure that there are I know there are distinct differences, with wine, because there's different perceptions. It's a higher cost per ounce usually. It's definitely a higher cost per alcohol by volume.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and the purchasing is more infrequent than beer. So I think there are dynamics that play, and that's the magic of this, in my opinion, is that once you start talking about these things with distributors or distributors talking to suppliers, you stop talking about subjective terminology, and that's where things really shut down, because really the most important resource for all of us, companies, and as individuals, is time. And so, if you're going to sit there for an hour and have a conversation, you should both be prepared to have a constructive conversation instead of saying, hey, we want a 20% increase. And the funny thing for a supplier is you might think that's aggressive, but your potential could be greater than that.
Yeah.
And as a distributor, you could be looking at that going, wow, I don't have anybody really doing 20%. And the danger in that is that you could be missing out the potential to develop a brand that could be dynamic and represent growth. And what I know about distributors is, especially larger ones, 1% is a really big gain for any distributor, sizable distributor. And so eking out those 1% gains on something, looking at it as a potential standpoint and not resisting a high goal, it just changes the nature of the conversation and the entire relationship.
Here, Mikey, too, what Chris does really well is like this pods over velocity.
Yeah.
And then you've got this $600 or 600 case target. But what we want to actually get to, and Chris, this is where you're talking about like, hey, we're 400 cases short of our collective goal.
Right.
So how do we, like, that to me is the magic. And this was the point that like fired in my brain right away, was like, we've taken the subjectivity, like you just said, out of the conversation. We've documented an arithmetic around how do we get to what it could do. And then now there's a gap. And that gap is 400 cases. So how do we get through that gap, which maybe you can't close it, maybe you can close it. But is that what you're really focused on, is like, how do I get to that conversation as efficiently as possible?
Yes, sort of. I think really it's about the system, right? The system and the ways of working that come with it. And one of the things that I've learned in my career is that there is no organization that rises to the level of their goals. What they do is they perform at the level or the value of their systems. And so having a system where you can function together and optimize your potential is really what this is about. And so this could be in setting initial goals, or this could be about gap closure. Because, look, I served 2 years in the Army, and I had a captain at the time who was very cerebral. He was a really bright guy, a guy named Max McDonald. And so he was, it was interesting to talk to him about things, because sometimes he would just sit with us as individual soldiers, which most officers do not do. And so I remember asking him a question one time about expectations, and he said, look, no matter what your plans are, that'll change the minute the first shot's fired, right? So you're not going to get the goals right. What's going to happen is that you have to have this conversation ongoing. You'll have an annual plan that ties into your 5-year plan, and then you have to have quarterly business reviews. And in the gaps in between, you have to have constructive conversation about whether you are on goal or sometimes over goal, rare. And so how do you then maximize what the potential is going forward, or close the gap to get back to where you thought you were going to be? So, to me, it's about the implementation of a system and having effective ways of working that benefits both. It's like a strategic partnership. It benefits both partners.
Love it. Yeah. And I love that you speak to the disconnect, right, between some suppliers and distributors. And I love your philosophy and the way you go about it. And I feel like a lot of times there is a misalignment when suppliers are targeting, goals for our distributors, and they don't really look into it like you do. And there's some other market, variables that go into exactly what the makeup is and how we're targeting some of those products. What other kind of key factors do you believe that we should be looking at, and how do we get more suppliers in line with your philosophy of way of thinking as well?
Well, and what I would say to that is really if I could effectively get suppliers and distributors in a room and say, listen, you're both wrong. You need to find a way to effectively work together. And here's some ideas on how to accomplish that. And really, it gets back to the center of the presentation I gave, Bud, that you attended, is about truth and integrity and trust. And so if you have a team that is highly functioning, it's a team that trusts each other. And, there's competence and trust. And that's kind of the axis of success, in my opinion, for individuals and for companies. And you should have, a philosophical, cultural approach to that in developing that kind of relationship with all of your stakeholders, whether it is your investors, your suppliers, your customers, your employees. And I think that's where, when you take a step back from what we're talking about, really the nuts and bolts of Supplier Math 101, and you start with strategy and culture and vision, and then you start to break things down. Typically what I see is one of two things happening. One, you have vision, right, with charismatic leaders that stand up and talk about and rah and get a lot of people, excited about things. But then when it comes to execution, something's missing. The nuts and bolts are missing. How do you apply that to actually execute and reach your goals? And then on the other side, you've got very tactical approaches that have a lot of nuts and bolts. We want to be up 5%. And then you're out in the marketplace chasing 5% without any direction, right? Without any strategy, without kind of the bigger picture. And so what happens is you end up lacking efficiency, wasting resources. And to me, what execution is all about is the appropriate application of resources.
When you get started with better said, when you started working on this with wholesalers, what was the initial response when you started coming back to them?
Yeah. So what's interesting is when I stepped into, I have been a leader in my adult life, both in the Army and in college, and a number of times. And I'll tell you, that is a humbling experience when you start to reflect and develop self-awareness and realize, it's one, you don't know anything, especially initially. And two, you always have to be learning and growing and developing. And so it comes back to me as a mindset. And so when you sit down and you start to put these things together and you start speaking in their terms, everything changes. So to answer your question, the reception was extremely positive. And one of the things that I would always check in, so I had the benefit of those leaders at Hess sending me to the Center for Creative Leadership in Greenville, South Carolina. And, that they focus very much on developing self-awareness. And again, that is a humbling experience when, you're coming from sales and sales is about being assertive, right? And so when you really stop and step back and you talk to these leaders, especially the midline leaders, and they realize that you understand their language and you start to speak to them on their terms, that doesn't mean that you concede anything. That doesn't mean that you aren't there to, really drive the goals of your organization to the greatest degree that you can, because at the end of the day, that's all of our objectives in business. It just means that now you're gaining alignment, and you also have the benefit of listening and checking your own expectations, with oftentimes is something missing, in any supplier customer relationship. And so then you form strategic partnerships. And, at that point, it's still not easy, but it certainly is more productive and profitable.
That's the key thing, is that it's profitable and you're moving the needle. I would imagine that the first person the first few people, there's like finally somebody's coming with a, top down approach, not a production driven plan up through like, I'm going to produce all this stuff. Now you got to go sell it.
Yeah, exactly. And especially where you really lean into that conversation, which some of the larger guys do. And so then there becomes, where you have a system, and then where your culture might be in a disconnect. I think what happens is your system is not as effective as it could be. And so when you're mandating goals, it might feel good if you hit that goal, but how did you hit that goal? Is this sustainable? Could you have done better if you would have taken a different approach? I mean, that's my thinking. And I think one of the things I used to do, is I would check in with distributors and I would ask them, what suppliers do you work with that really get it? What are the ones that you say function highly with your organization? The answer was always Gallo, which makes sense because they kind of wrote the book in the wine industry for, sales, and they've embedded themselves across the marketplace. And there's something to learn from that and watch and ask questions about, so then you can learn whatever it is that they know. But then the questions started to become over time, you guys really over index for your size. And that's really what you want to hear.
So, in today's market, declining beer market, declining wine market, right? And we're facing a lot of headwinds. And suppliers are more and more, we're seeing get more aggressive, right? Trying to close some of those gaps. Can you give us a few examples on how some of those targeted programs will help close some of those gaps, or any examples that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. So, one of the things to pull from some experience, a couple of achievements that my team had once we started to implement the ideology of strategic partnership. So, I remember sitting down with the strategic account manager for our distributor in Florida. And, the largest player in that market is Publix. And so you start asking questions, and then that leads to constructive feedback. And he said, hey, would you guys be willing to invest in programming with them? Because at that point, they had been going through transition between their warehouses, moving from a warehouse to a high volume and a low volume warehouse. And some some suppliers, their brands were falling out in that transition and going DSD, which forces your price up, which has a lot of pressure on demand. And so, one of the things that I took away from that I later took back to ownership is, the one way, and this is always about strategic partnership, you sit down and you ask, what are your goals? How do you plan to achieve them? What's your strategy? And so I used to spend, running national accounts, I would have 10 to 15 minutes in an annual review. And I would spend my first question asking that question of them, wasting time. However, it was for the long term very constructive. So with Publix, I convinced leadership to invest in what they call a BOGO. So the buy one, get one. Not every market is able to do that, but that was Publix's main strategy. The investment was massive on the front end. We're talking six figures, and for 6 figures per SKU. And so for us, that was a significant investment. And we had a commercial tier called Select, and we only had one item in the high volume warehouse, which was the Chardonnay. And we had 6 items in the commercial tier. And so, in convincing ownership to make this investment, we were able to take and we did it consecutively. It was a 5-year plan for all of the additional 5 SKUs to get in the high volume warehouse. And the objective was, as my prior example, what's the 5-year goal? What is our potential, right? And then how do we break that down? So at the time that we had this conversation, that we were doing 14,000 cases across the entire retail footprint in 4 states, and which they had about 1,000 locations at the time. And so what's the potential? And so we set that long-term goal at 45,000 cases, triple what we were doing, right? And we started investing. We hit that in 3 years. And my thought process is that after the investment is done, it's going to tail off substantially, but we'll still fall back to about 30 to 35. They held it over 40,000 cases ever since. So, that's one of those things when you talk about potential, and I still stay in touch with my manager at the time that was driving, contributing to that strategy and executing locally. And it fundamentally changed the business. And it not only got that tier in, but opened up the last count, I think 4 or 5 luxury placements. And then as they expanded their footprint up into Virginia, we were added to those set as well. So the idea behind strategy and investing in strategic partnerships, that's a really good example. And I'll give you one more because this is something that I imagine all categories struggle with, is price increases. So we were taking a price increase consecutively on what I would call our entry-level luxury Napa Cabernet. And the reaction is very subjective. I remember it was, oh my God, you're going to kill the brand. And so at the time we were doing very low by the glass to get features and consumer awareness through consumer trial. And our, price was, I think, like $30, which we were easily $10 over our closest competitor, under our closest competitor. And from a cost standpoint, the item wasn't really profitable. So the way that we structured those conversations with distributors could only happen if we had the relationship that we had developed. The reaction was the same, but we were able to talk through it and say, okay, well, the people who know the price will see the price increase. The people that have never seen it will not see the price increase, because we're out there making pitches then for distribution and accounts that have never bought it. And so once you start having conversations like that, and you have an understanding of the market and how that works, it shifts the conversation to, you're going to drop 30%, to, okay, we're going to drop something. Let's define and let's break that down into metrics that we can control, because you can't control the emotion of the situation.
I've listened to a pricing expert on more of a element of focusing around high value services. But the idea behind it is that she breaks it into 2 parts. There's utility. Everybody knows what a gallon of gas is and what a gallon of milk is and a carton of eggs. That's the utility food when you go to the grocery store. Nobody really cares about how much the hot sauce is.
Right.
Because nobody's paying attention to it. Like, we just buy the hot sauce, right? I mean,
yeah.
There's no measuring stick for it. So that's super intelligent what you went through in that price increase example. It's like, it's not something that maybe every day is buying. And there's a group of people that just don't even know, don't even care. They're looking at this label and they're going to grab it, or it's their favorite, and who cares? Like, they're going to move forward with that price point regardless.
What's interesting about that specific example is that we were able to continue to grow the brand over 3 to 5 years. We had some markets that were flat. We had some markets that were down, maybe a couple touch double digits, but the strategy worked.
Yeah.
And it worked because we were able to have intelligent conversations about tactics and breaking it down for the people that had to go do the work and gaining their alignment. And I think that that's key. And back to your conversation about utility, I love to hear that, because that is economics, microeconomics 101. Like
Yeah. Mhm.
all of us, that went to college that took economics will remember that.
You'd fit in great with the VXP team because we got some economics nerds and engineers hanging on our team
Yeah, see,
for sure.
I love talking that stuff, but it bores the hell out of most people.
No, it's right in our wheelhouse. So if somebody's listening to this, Chris, and whether you're a distributor or a supplier, because we've got a little bit of both, we got a lot of distributors listening, but we've got some suppliers too, and they wanted to do what in your advice is like the first step to move down this direction of a systematic approach to setting, planning, and sales processes around goal setting and targeting together?
It's a good question. So the way that I would answer that is develop an understanding of the market, sit down together and ask questions and listen, because you're going to learn something you don't know. And you might agree with it, you might not, but you're going to learn something you don't know. And then from there, once the ways of working issues begin to be solved, everything else will start to come together. So to me, that's where, when you have a team sitting shoulder to shoulder at a table, having constructive and informed conversations, the rest starts to handle itself. If you don't have that, it doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how clever your branding is. It doesn't matter what your packaging is like. You can't possibly go lower on your price. It's not going to help you reach your potential. And so, I would say, if you have teams, distributor and supplier alike, that are dysfunctional internally or externally with, supplier partners or distributor partners, work on that first.
So, great advice. Now, somebody's listening to this, they want to get in contact with you, they potentially want to do business with you or find you. Chris, where can they find you? How do they hunt you down?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've thought a lot about this, and now I'm interested and curious about the beer side of things. And with the alcohol industry, there's a lot of crossover with the newer generations, and so I'm going to be looking at beer producers and helping them, with professional management of their distribution networks. I feel like I have a new innovative business um, business model to apply to the marketplace that helps control cost and aggregate their voice, which, if you're operating right now as an independent and you're trying to go alone and you're not one of the big guys, you're going to struggle. And so for me, the way to get a hold of me, if you want to have those conversations, whether it's just, seeking a consultation or actually looking to, add to a portfolio or become part of a broader portfolio, Chris@IrelandFamilyWines.com would be the easiest way to reach me. If I don't recognize the number, I don't usually answer my cell phone. So, especially in a political season like right now, where
I don't
you just
blame you.
bombarded with phone calls.
Well,
So
you live in a battleground state,
Yeah.
right? So,
yeah, not anymore. You guys do. So
we do, yes.
Michigan is now. I think this has gone red the last couple of seasons. So
Yeah, my phone's been ringing off the hook, and
We're getting
text
crushed.
messages.
yeah, it's buzzing in my pocket 5 times as we've been talking. So
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Last ditch effort. So, okay. So reach out to you via an email. Is that a little prelude then, Chris? Are you actively helping brands work with your network of wholesalers you're already working with then too?
So the preparation for the speech that you attended
Yeah.
actually was a shift in direction for me. And
Okay.
so it really helped me define, because at the time, we're really starting to get a lot of negative feedback from data in the marketplace, and it's all very concerning. And so, one of the best things an entrepreneur can do is look for issues in the marketplace and then figure out how to solve them and, make a living in doing so. And so for me, I love this industry, especially the wine side. But look, I've been a beer drinker for my whole life too, right? So, and bourbon and spirits. But the idea that there are producers out there that have been around multiple generations, or who are innovators and just put all of their life savings into a project, and that macroeconomic conditions are going to force them out of business, to me, I can help with that. And, I think the business model that I'm crafting is a really strong solution. I think the importance of aggregating your interest and amplifying your voice in the marketplace through a broader portfolio is the number one way to help. And professional management, knowing what questions to ask, knowing how to approach and manage these relationships. Not everybody knows how to do that. And if you hire somebody, you'll be lucky to find that kind of talent and have it be affordable.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Chris, thanks for joining us today. You rock.
Thanks
I
for
really
having me.
appreciate it. Very intelligent conversation, just like what it was when you did that presentation in Ohio. So I really appreciate the effort you're putting into the industry to have these conversations. I don't think not enough people like you get appreciation back of trying to change the conversation, trying to get to a better, more positive relationship between wholesalers and suppliers. And ultimately, hey, newsflash, when done well, this will grow the beverage alcohol category, which solves all the category issues we've talked about as well too today.
Yep. Agreed.
So thanks for joining us, my man. We appreciate you. And
Thanks
if
for
you're out
having
in
me.
the tapped in sales land listening, reach out to Chris on his email. What is it one more time, Chris?
Chris, CHRIS, at Ireland Family Wines, plural. Ireland, just like the country.
Love it. IrelandFamilyWines.com. Reach out to him there, and you rock. If you like this, listen, share, subscribe, share with your friends. We appreciate all our tapped in listeners, and y'all rock. So cheers.
Awesome.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.